Hello everyone. Welcome to this fourth lesson in sculpting the head using Zbrush Dynamesh. In this lesson we're just going to continue on where we left off on the last one. If you remember on the last one I had extended the torso and I had kind of just shown you how the muscles intersect and how they go over the bony landmarks and basically how you want to kind of think of your sculpt while you're doing it. So I want to also thank you for the comments and the feedback. I really appreciate it. I know some of you want the image files as reference, so I will make those available. However, you can use any images that you want, and you'll find that during this tutorial I actually don't use the reference images that much. You should have, on the image planes that is, but you should have your own image references anyway that you can use, that you can look and refer to look at the forms and kind of pick things that you like about faces and portraits. So maybe you want to create a reference sheet full of faces of actors or interesting people, things that speak to you, things that you want to not necessarily copy but take inspiration from. So the methods I'm showing you can work with any kind of reference image, and I understand that sculpting the head, sculpting anything can be really frustrating, but sculpting the head in particular is quite challenging, and it does take a lot of practice and a lot of patience. I've been a traditional sculptor for 15 years, so if I make it look easy, it's just because I've been practicing for a long time, and ZBrush is no different. ZBrush is, it does have some handy shortcuts to some things in the fact that you can sculpt symmetrically at the same time. So you do one side and automatically the other side gets sculpted, but it doesn't do the work for you. So it is a matter of practice and persistence and just a lot of patience, because it is frustrating. And sometimes it's still frustrating for me to this day. You get stuck. And so if you find that you are getting stuck, and to know if you to understand if you're stuck or not, the easiest way to figure that out is that you keep on kind of going over things, but not really doing, you're just kind of fiddling and just kind of going over forms without any real ideas or direction. And you just kind of, I guess the best way to put it is just kind of dilly-dallying over things and, kind of not really making any progress. So at that point, it's probably a good time to step away and maybe look at your reference and take a step back and come back at it with fresh eyes. And then you'll find that you can probably continue. That's usually getting stuck is just a matter of not knowing how to proceed, and a lot of the time that's caused by lack of good reference. So I will provide the image references that I used. I will also provide the Z tool that we're going to create out of this tutorial. Not the one that I showed before, because I'm using that in my own project, but I'll give you guys the Z tool and maybe the Z project, the ZPR file of the one we finish in here. Okay, so I hope that's okay. And so having said that, let's continue on. And of course, if you have any questions, leave a comment. Now, at this point, I'm not in perspective. Okay, so I'm going to put it in perspective, and this is pretty good. Let me just see what we're at. We're at 50. I'm gonna probably leave it there. If you find it's too distorted, you can always bring it down a little bit. You can maybe go down, maybe 35. Now just keep in mind that in ZBrush, so this was found in the draw palette. In ZBrush, the actual perspective angle doesn't correspond to anything in real life, nor does it correspond to other packages like 3ds Max or Blender or anything like that. So don't expect to save any of these perspective perspective parameters and be able to use them in another package, because they don't correspond. Quite frankly, I don't even know how you would save the parameters. So they're just for use within ZBrush. So you kind of have to go by eye. You have to go with what looks right to you. So you want something with a little bit of perspective, because otherwise it looks unnatural. But you don't want it too distorted. You don't want it to give it too much of a fisheye lens effect. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to grab the clay buildup. So B, C, B, and just going to start refining some forms. So if you remember from my last video, I was just going over the flow of the muscle structure, and I'm going to try to avoid smoothing as much as possible. So we're still at about 640 polygons. So it's pretty low. You're not doing any kind of detail work. You're working mostly on the secondary forms, the major planes of the face and things like that. The detail is really the very final thing that you look at, and it's pretty much, you can consider it kind of like the icing of the cake, or like the very last thing you do to decorate a cake. So right now we're kind of just trying to go all around and just refining our forms. Now I'm going to go and switch to the clay tubes. I'm going to press B, bring out the brush menu, C for clay and T for tubes, and I'm just going to bring the intensity down. Now I'll show you why. It's very similar to the clay buildup brush. It just doesn't go up as high in terms of displacement on the mesh. Let me just undo that. So I like to bring it down to about 15. This depends on what I'm doing, so just make sure you press enter. And the reason I like using the clay tubes at this lower intensity is because it creates very subtle forms. And so creating forms this way, because I've got pretty much all my major forms pretty much established. I mean, the ear needs a lot of work, but apart from that, I've got pretty much everything in place. And this allows me to, using the additive and pressing Alt subtractive qualities of the brush, to kind of subtly change the forms. And I'll end up cross-hatching. So I find cross-hatching very much like traditional clay. You cross-hatch with a rake tool or a loop tool to try to make the surface more even. And so if you were just going in one direction, you wouldn't really get a nice even surface. So I like to get an even surface, but I like to keep the texture on it, because I find that with this texture, if you look at it at a distance, I know it's really low res right now, but it kind of has that skin quality to it. Now I could actually bring this up a little bit. Maybe just try 17. Yeah, let's try that. I think it's a little low. Now, of course, the pressure of the tablet pressure as well influences the displacement. So the height of the stroke and how it affects your model. So if I press harder, I can actually affect it more. But you want to adjust the intensity a little bit. At least for me, I find that works really well. Okay, so just taking a look at this now, I'm noticing that the nose seems a little wide for me, so I'm just going to press B for brush, M for the move tool, and V for the move tool for the regular move. And I'm just going to go up here, maybe bring down my draw size a little bit, and just start manipulating the nostril area a little bit. Now, of course, this is going to depend on the reference images you're using. Whoops. I'm kind of doing this by eye. And also, I noticed from this angle, from the 3/4 view, he's kind of looking kind of weird, kind of puffy. Something's a little bit out of whack, so I think I have to bring those shapes in backwards a little bit. So I'm just going to... Now, the cool thing about symmetry is that I can work on either side, and it's going to affect both sides. So, you know, whatever angle I feel I can see better, I can actually manipulate. So I see, since on this side, I can't really tell what's going on in terms of the outer shape on this side here. So I'm going to manipulate this side and look at this side, already knowing that this side's going to be the same. Now, of course, eventually you're going to want to get out of symmetry, but we're not at that stage yet. That's more down the line. It's good to have symmetry first, and then make it asymmetrical and more natural later on once you've established all the forms properly. So looking at your reference, you want to just see how that, how that looks on the 3/4 view. Now I may have taken it down a little too far, but that's okay. I'm going to just go into the clay tubes again, B, C, T, and with the Alt, I'm going to bring this down a little bit. So I'm just keeping Alt pressed. So although it doesn't show up here, I'm actually in Z sub right now. So you won't actually visually see it, but just know that if you press Alt, it means alternate brush mode. So, and this works with all the brushes. So a brush that normally would cut in, if you press Alt, will actually displace. So bring up the surface, and vice versa. So if normally the brush brings the surface upwards, it's gonna cut into it if you press the Alt. So now here it seems like it's a little bit too cut in, so I'm just going to bring the outer edges here. Just fill them in a little bit. And a lot of this comes from looking at reference and also experience, so don't worry if you don't see a lot of this stuff on your own. It just takes practice. It's just, these are the things that I've come to learn just from doing. Yeah, so now you see, because I'm cross hatching, I'm actually in a way smoothing out the forms a little bit. Now, not smoothing to the point where they look very fake and CG, but smooth like skin. Your skin's not perfect. It has irregularities, and that's what's going to make it more realistic, right? If you have these irregularities that catch the light, that's what makes your skin on your model. It's going to make that model look a lot more realistic. So, and alive as well. Like, it has a kind of life to it. So now, if you look at this, excuse me, I'm just going to zoom back a little bit. From a distance, this surface looks alive and interesting, and it catches the light more than it would if it was just smooth. And now to show you that, to illustrate, let me just smooth it out, and I'll show you what I mean. Maybe just go to X. I'll just do one side here, and I'm just going to smooth it. So I'm just pressing Shift and using the smooth function. So I'm just holding down Shift. Now, if I wanted, there's two modes to using the Shift. There's two modes in the smooth brush. One of them is by just holding down Shift and pressing down with your pen on the tablet and just smoothing over. And the other one is alternate algorithm, is holding down Shift, pressing on the surface, and then let go of Shift while still pressing on the surface. And what this does is that it actually relaxes the mesh a little bit. So if we go into frame, polyframe, it actually relaxes the mesh. So here I'm just using regular smooth, and here I'm going to let go and use the alternate. And let's go out and back in. and you can see it kind of quads it. It really relaxes the mesh. So that's an alternate smooth, and if you find you have areas of pinching or you know, areas that are need to be relaxed because they're not displacing properly, you're not able to sculpt on them properly, you can use that little trick. Or it's almost, if you use that alternate smooth, it's almost like you're smoothing even more, like it's a heavier smooth. So if you find you're getting kind of a bumpy surface, for instance, right now I'm using that alternate smooth, and you can see it's really relaxing the surface and just making it almost metallic looking. You know, it's so smooth. Actually, I should have done this. Let's do this. So let me just, oops. So I'm just going to use the alternate smooth. I'm going to smooth the one side here. And just to show you, I'm using a mask, so it'll only be affected on the one side. I'm going to clear the mask. And if you look at it now, apart from the fact that it kind of tends to blur things, the smooth looks very unnatural for skin. Okay, so your skin looks natural if you have a surface on it. Our skin is generally, for the most part, fairly matte, so it doesn't really reflect. It doesn't have a high specularity value, whereas this now does. So I find that if you do this, it kind of makes everything look a little bit unnatural. Just go into the Damien Standard brush, BDS. Okay, even if when I start to add lines, you know, it actually looks a little bit better, but it still looks unnatural. So what makes your skin look more natural? Let's go into the inflate, B-I-N, and I'm just going to bring it down to maybe 5. And I'm going to change the stroke to spray, and I'm just going to pick like an alpha that would be good for pores. So this is still low res, so it's not going to really show up that well, but let me just add a surface on here. So I'm just kind of doing this to show you. Okay, now let's go out a little bit. So it's not really high res enough to capture fine detail, but so already, yeah, that should be good. So already, it looks kind of funny, but already it looks more like skin because it has this matte, irregular surface. But still, it looks unnatural. So, you know, you basically what I find is that if you use this approach and don't, excuse me, and don't over smooth your sculpture and just use the tool marks and keep them there, when you go later on to add pore details, the surface already lends itself to looking more natural. So these little tool marks actually help you to give you that really natural skin look. So this is just something that, you know, I would do as a traditional artist as well. So let's just go back. I'm just using the scrub up here to go back to where we were before. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but that was just kind of the idea of behind why I like to use the clay tubes and the clay buildup and just keep the surface a little bit irregular. So you won't see me smoothing a lot. Sometimes I will, but if I do, maybe it'll be really light, you know. But still, already to me that doesn't look that natural. So let me undo that. Okay, so let's go into clay tubes, BCT, and we're at 15. Let's just put on the, although we probably don't need it for this model, I'm just going to put on, go in the brush menu and put on into auto masking. Go into auto masking and press backface mask. And if you remember, backface just means that on any thin areas or adjacent areas, like really areas that are really close together, the brush won't affect it. So sometimes if you're in a really thin area, you'll be sculpting on one side, and then the other side will collapse onto it, and it creates a big mess. So I just put that on. I usually just put it on all the time. So just keep in mind that that is a per brush specific setting. So if you change brush, you have to put on backface mask for the next brush you use if you want it. Okay, so let's just follow the muscle structure again, and just continuing with shapes. So if you remember, I had sculpted this guy with his eyes closed, and it was just something I'm playing with, just started doing recently. I kind of like the idea. I actually got it from watching a video from Matthew Keane, and he sculpts them this way first, and it kind of looks neat. I think it kind of looks like somebody's sleeping, so it makes me not have to worry about the eye until a later point. So I thought it was kind of neat to try this technique. So I'm just going around and kind of smoothing and finding any areas that have some divots or just irregularities that don't quite match my reference. So the thing about the clay brushes also is that they tend to fill in the deeper areas first, and then they'll raise up the surface. So it's almost like you're priming and sanding and spot puttying, if you were doing a sculpture or something like that in real life. Kind of get the surface nice and even. Just going around. Okay. So I think what we're going to do now is maybe we'll cut this guy off here. So I'm just going to press Control Shift. While keeping it pressed, click on this brush icon and select the clip curve. And so I'm going to Control Shift and click and drag out this line. And I can actually let go. I can let go of Control and Shift at this point as long as I keep my pen pressed. So I don't have to have like three fingers pressing three different buttons. Actually, right now I'm just using my pen hand to drag this along. And if I want to move this, I can just use the spacebar. When I keep the spacebar pressed, it's just going to move it along. Now we're going to try to go in an area where there's not too much of an undercut, because if we use an undercut, it'll actually flatten it out. So let's just see what happens here. Okay, it's just going to save the project. Okay, so if you notice, it did what I thought it was going to do, and that's what happens when you try to cut something that has an undercut. And that's because the slice tool, the clip curve, actually just flattens the polygons. It's not actually cutting anything. So let's just undo that. And let's do another way. Let's try, so I did the exact same thing as I did before. Control Shift, click on the menu. And let's pick the slice curve. So the slice curve actually won't cut your model, but this is what it'll do. So I'm going to do the same thing, Control Shift, drag. And what it's going to do, okay, it seems like it didn't actually do anything, but watch, if you actually press Shift F to go into polyframe, you notice that it created a new poly group. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind about the slice curve brush is it actually doesn't work in symmetry. So just to illustrate, it only works on one side, even though I have symmetry pressed. So if I wanted to get this information, this poly group on the other side in a symmetrical fashion, I just go to Geometry, Modify Topology, and Mirror and Weld. And there you go. Okay, so let's undo that because we only want the second poly group here. So what I'm going to do is Control Shift and click on this menu over here and just press this select rectangle or select lasso. And the reason I'm doing this is sometimes when you have the clip brushes or the trim brushes or the slice brushes selected, it's hard to select poly groups. You can sometimes do it, but I find that if you just switch into the regular selection tools, it's a lot easier to just pick the poly groups. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to Control Shift and click, and then Control Shift and click again. Sorry, let's do that again. Control Shift click, Control Shift and drag, and it's going to basically switch the poly groups that were visible. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm still in the geometry palette. Geometry, go down to Modify Topology. That's where Mirror and Weld was, and I'm going to look at Del Hidden. Okay, so it looks like nothing happened, but if I Control Shift drag, nothing shows up, right? So now Control drag, and it's going to Dynamesh, and so it filled that hole. Okay, it's hard to see, but it also filled it with black for some reason. So let's just go to Color, RGB, so Color, Fill Object, and White. I had white selected here. There. So now, if we re-Dynamesh, you can see that it doesn't have that flattening that was happening before. So, getting back on track, let's go into the clay tubes. Actually, let's do this. What we could do now is I'll show you how to hollow the eye so that you can place a subtool in there. So let's go into clay buildup, and I'm going to press B, C, B, and with the Alt, I'm just going to dig this out a bit. Now, don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, but just try to keep in mind that you can lower the draw size a little bit too. At this point, you should probably re-Dynamesh, because you're getting a lot of stretching and it's not really helping, not really sculpting properly. Let's just shift and relax that mesh a bit and just carve out the eye a little bit. Okay, let's re-Dynamesh. Boom. Okay. So now we have a funny kind of eye looking opening here. So that doesn't matter because we're going to fix it up later. But what we're going to do now is append a subtool. And I'm going to go at a perspective for this. So look how unnatural it looks when you come at a perspective. That's why it's kind of nice to sculpt in perspective, because that's what we're used to seeing in real life. So let's go into the subtool, go down to append, and then I'm going to pick the sphere 3D. And it's going to show up here. Now I'm actually not sculpting on the sphere. I'm going to have to select it. So I can select it either by pressing here in the menu, okay, or I could press N as in Nancy, and it'll show up. All my subtools would show up if I had multiple subtools. Okay. Or I can press Alt and just click on it. Okay, so there's 3 different ways you can actually select your subtools. Right now, if I try to sculpt on this, it's already been converted to a Polymesh 3D, so PM3D, when you append it into your subtool palette, but it doesn't have symmetry on, nor does it have Dynamesh. So if you look, I have to actually press symmetry in order to make symmetry active. So let's just undo that. So that's just something to keep in mind. Whenever you append another subtool, you're going to have to automatically activate symmetry. Okay. Now, if you were to split a group and create another subtool and it had symmetry before, most likely the symmetry will be on there already. But in this case, when you append a new subtool, you have to add symmetry by pressing X or going in transform tool palette in the transform palette and activating it manually. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now let's just go into solo mode here, and if you remember, I talked about this before. When you're using a primitive sphere, because it was generated from a cube, it has these poles on it which really aren't great to sculpt on. So if I try to sculpt on this, you'll notice that everything else is quadded, but at the top, let me actually divide it so you can see even at higher subdivision levels it's still not great to sculpt on. It's okay over here actually. It's not too bad. But look at all that stretching. So let's just undo that. So what I want to do is just go into Dynamesh because I actually want that. So geometry, Dynamesh. I'm just going to use the default settings, but I'm going to take project and blur off and hit Dynamesh. And so now, whoops. Actually, let's undo that. Let's press polish. Keep the polish. So the polish is actually going to polish the surface. And there you can see how smooth that became. So if you look, there's now no poles whatsoever. So it makes it really great to sculpt on. And if you control drag, you can see that the polish kind of polishes it off a bit. So it's perfect for making the eye. So now let's go into the standard brush, BST, and let's select drag rectangle. And I'm going to pick an alpha. Let's try this one. Let's try alpha 1. And I'm trying to go into the center. So on this axis, I'm going to have to go by eye, but in the x-axis, I can tell that we're in the center when the two dots meet. So I'm going to press down and drag, and that's going to create the wrong shape. So Control Z. Let's try. I forgot which one I use. Let's try this one maybe. So again, two dots together, drag. I think that's pretty good. Okay. So I'm just creating the shape of an eye, a rough shape. Let me re-Dynamesh, and it's just gonna make that nice and smooth. So that's just to get a really basic shape. Now if you wanted to, you could do Alt, go to center again, and just create like a pupil. So that's not quite in the center. Let's try, still not in the center. A little bit of trial and error, folks. That's kind of what we have to do. Okay. Let's just make it a little deeper. And if I press 1 without touching anything, I can just replay last. And that probably will give me a pretty good idea of an eye. See if that works. It's just going to be a placeholder anyway. We just want something to create a little bit of a shadow. So if I want to actually make this a little bit deeper, what I can do is click RGB, color, fill object. That'll make it white. So now when I try to select a different color, it doesn't change color. And let's just pick a black. And with the standard brush, I'm going to go back to stroke. And I'll pick alpha 1, and I'm just going to, Control Z. So remember to take the Z add off, or else you're going to actually sculpt. And here I'm just going to color it in. So now we have a nice black, make it look more like an eye, like a pupil. Take RGB off, Z add, switch back to white by pressing V. So if you press V, it alternates between these two colors. It's basically activating the switch colors here, which you can see the hotkey is V. Okay, so let's go out of solo. Okay, so now we have to scale. Let's just press 9 to save this. Okay, so let's select our subtool. We should be already there. Yeah. So if you bring up the subtool menu with the N key, you can tell that we're in the eyeball because we only have two subtools anyway. So let's press E and drag this out. Now I want to get it out of symmetry at this point because otherwise it creates a weird distortion. Well, in this case it doesn't because we're using the scale, but as soon as I want to move it, it'll do that. So Control Z. Let's go into take off X. Let's just move back a little bit. And let's scale it down a little. And then let's go to the side view. Let's go out of perspective. Forward. So all I did was click the blue over here, or you could just simply drag it out. And if you want it to snap, you just keep shift pressed. I'm going to press W. And with shift press, I'm going to press the inner white circle to move it on that exact plane. Now let's drag it out again, press E, and just using that red inner circle over here, I'm just going to drag it, and now I'm going to zoom in and press W, and if I Alt and hold on to Alt while I press on it, I can actually freely move the subtool. Now obviously I'm going to have to change view. Let's go to F and go forward, and let's just drag out the line here, snap it, E for scale, and just scale it down a bit. Now let's press W to move this, and I'm going to move it on this exact line. Let's go into transparency mode. Now the size of your eyeball should actually be the distance between each eye, or rather the distance between each eye is the same distance as each eyeball. So this distance here has to be equal to this distance over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale this down a little bit, matching this area. It's probably about there. I think I might be a little bit close with these eye openings, so I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, and I'm going to bring it back to the side here. Now the other thing you want to line up is the side of your pupil here should line up with the corner of the mouth. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Maybe the eye could go up a little bit. So your eyeballs should be basically at the third, in thirds. So you have 1/3 here where the mouth is, and 1/3 here, and then roughly 1/3 here. Or it's 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 actually. So usually you have a third here, a third roughly where the nose is, and a third where the chin is. But here again, you're in thirds when you're dividing. So if you see 1, 2, 3, it's almost perfect. Now it can vary a little bit, but that's just the general guideline. So let's just get out of transparency mode so you can see what we're doing. So that looks a little funny right now. So what we're going to do is going to modify topology and just press mirror and weld. And mirror and weld will always mirror what's on this side, which is why I put the eye on this side. Now, if you didn't have the eye on this side, you could simply go into deformation, mirror, and if you had the eye on this side, it'd mirror over to this side, and then you can just do mirror and weld again. So that's a pretty easy way of adding eyes. Now it looks to me like these eyes are a little forward, so let's press W, and yeah, for sure you can see that your eye is supposed to be more down in this area here. So let's go back a bit, and it should be kind of like that proportion wise. So I think that looks pretty good, and of course we're going to tweak it as we go, you know. Don't worry about trying to get it perfect. It almost seems like a little cross-eyed, so let's just move out pupils. Oops, Control Z, let's press X for symmetry. This time you want symmetry. Might have to rotate these pupils a bit, so let's just bring the transpose line up and go into center and press R. So I'm going to press R to go into rotate, and just in the center I'm going to drag and rotate the position of these pupils a little bit. Then I'm going to go into move W and just bring them out a little. So I'm going to go by eye. Sorry, that was a terrible pun and definitely unintentional. Okay, that looks alright. Now, you know, keep in mind that the eye I made might not be perfect, so it's just for us to kind of get an idea. It's probably better up there. So you're going to have to tweak it here and there, especially because we don't have this orbital area with the eyelids and everything really refined, so it kind of looks funny right now. Actually, let's go and select the head tool. So Alt and click. And just to be sure, I'm pressing N and the eyeballs show up, so that means that we've actually switched it. So that's the selected subtool right now. And let's use the move tool, BMV, and let's just drag the corner of the eyes down a bit. So the nice thing about using a subtool is that because I'm working on a different subtool, I'm not actually wrecking anything that with the eyes. So I can move these eyelids no problem, and because they're separated, I'm not affecting the eyeball underneath. So let's go into perspective mode. Actually, let's go back to orthographic, and let's use the clay buildup, BCB, and let's start giving the eye some definition. There you go. Just, excuse me, adding some shape. There's a little bit of fatty tissue here, or loose tissue, and on the lid, just bring that down to kind of give him a little bit of an expression. It's kind of a dormant expression, it seems. We're going to fix that, so let's just go this way as well. So I'm just kind of cross-hatching and building up the form. That's why it's nice to put in the eyes fairly quickly, is because the eyes tend to give a sense of your character. So depending on the eye shape and the expression, you can really kind of get a sense of where you're going. So let's add a little bit of filling in here. So a little bit of... Now, of course, your eyes and your features will depend on gender as well. So a female will have much nicer and smoother features and rounder, depending on the age as well. So depending on the age of your character, you're going to want to add more lines or less lines or things of that nature accordingly. So somebody who's younger, like a child or in their 20s, is going to have a lot of different lines and wrinkles. They have hardly any, and their shape of their face will actually be a lot different than somebody who's an adult. So that's just something to keep in mind. So if you're following your reference, that'll all be shown to you. Okay, so just go into perspective, and let's just take the sides here down a bit. This is looking a little strange right now, so I'm going to probably have to fix this. This is out too much. So I'm not sure what's going on. Maybe I'll reinforce the jawline. Depends what I'm trying to do. His chin looks like a little bit too... Maybe it should come out more. Let's just build that up a little bit. And so now I built up the chin. Build it up more. It's always good to build it up and then just take it down a little bit if you want. So let's go into the clay tubes actually. BCT, and remember the intensity is low. And I'm just going to fill in this area. That was pretty good. Okay, so this arch here doesn't look right, so that should be probably filled in a bit. Usually jawlines are pretty straight in this area. Actually, it's going to move, BMV. Just bring this down a bit. Maybe adjust this side. So this is why you always want to be moving around. That's too far forward. I'm not really liking that chin. Let's bring this back a bit. Just making some small adjustments, just by eye, just trying to make something that looks fairly pleasing. That chin looks horrible, so let's go into clay tubes, BCT. And let's just take this, whoops, make sure RGB is off. And let's just take that off. Take it down a little bit. I'm pressing Alt. Let's maybe make the lips a little wider. Maybe that's too wide. Okay. Just go around, looking at forms, trying to judge what's not looking right, what's looking right. And maybe let's add some expression over here. I tend to make my characters have like a Clinty Switty, squinty-eyed look, which is really not what's happening right now, but eventually it would kind of look like that. So I just went to the move topological, which is BMT, and what that allows me is to make changes for the most part without affecting things that are close, like this lower lid. Just moving. So actually what I could do now is I could grab, still not looking quite right, but you know, it takes time. So let's go into use the pinch brush and press B, P, and I. And just go into corners here and just pinch a little bit, bring them together. You can actually do it here too. Just kind of looking, has a bit of a Asian feel right now, which is kind of cool. So sometimes, you know, you get happy accidents when you're doing this. So it's, you know, you might not have an idea in mind of a character you want to do, but then you start sculpting and you start getting, you know, cool little happy accidents. So maybe your first intention was not to create an Asian character, but then, you know, maybe it starts to look that like more you know, more of an Asian ethnic background, and you know, maybe you get ideas based on that, and you know, take it from there. So don't be afraid of happy accidents. Of course, unless you're following specific concept art or something like that. But let's go into the clay tubes, BCT, and let's start maybe refining this a bit. Now, if you're finding these pupils are distracting, what you can do is go into the subtool, make sure the white is on, press RGB, and then color, and fill object, making sure that your RGB intensity is at 100%. So that might look a little better now. But you know what? Let's maybe take the pupils right out. Let's just see what happens. So I'm just scrubbing down. That'd be too far. So let's just keep it here. Let's just keep it like that. I don't want to go through that right now because it's going to take a while, so I don't want to bore you guys with that. But let's go into the move, BMV. And if you notice, I switch a lot. Oops. Control Z. Let's make sure we're in the right subtool. Click on that. Pressing N. Bringing up the menu. And let's just adjust the eye from a different angle. So you want to I always like to look at my faces on this from this bottom view as well, because I can really tell where the planes of the face are, and you can really make adjustments that you can't see otherwise. You know, like that brow was a little bit too far, and you know, depends what kind of. Let's bring the nostrils in a bit. I can do a lot of cool little changes like this. So there's some weirdness going on here, but Doesn't take much, you know. It just a lot of the time it's very subtle things that just kind of throw everything off. So right now, I just made him kind of looking mean, you know, or determined. That's kind of cool. Just keep that. Here's a little bit calmer. So that's kind of cool in ZBrush. You can make these changes to the eyebrows. Here it looks, surprise. It's kind of weird. Alright. No. So you can make some cool facial changes, expressions pretty quick. And I just want a neutral expression for this guy. Let's actually go into the Damien standard and BDS. Let's actually Dynamesh. And let's make some cuts in here where the lid would be. Where you have that fold. Maybe just define some more shapes in here just to make it a little bit more defined. You know, it's really still not looking right, but this is what it's like. This is the process. You just gotta... Let me take that off. Again, from this other view, BMV, let's just bring this down. And you can look at yourself in the mirror too and just kind of see from different angles how these shapes interact. And you know, you make a change on one angle and you have to change it on the other one. So that's just something to keep in mind. You never just look at something from one angle and expect it to be perfect. You gotta work all around. So at this point, it's just a matter of tweaking it, seeing what works, see what doesn't. BCT for clay tubes, and I just want to fill this in a little bit. Looks kind of like it needs to be filled. Now, if I did want to do a more Asian character, there's a lot more characteristics that would have to change. For instance, I would probably have to make the nose a little bit less pronounced, and I would have to change the facial structure a little bit. So it's not just a matter... faces are very complex, which is great to learn because... Let's take our UV off. It's great to learn faces because once you know how to sculpt a face, you can pretty much sculpt anything because there's so many complex angles and complex shapes that are involved in a face that it's great practice. Once you become proficient and at sculpting heads, you know, you can sculpt anything. Like don't hold yourself back. It does take time. Like anything, you know, to become good at something, you got to do it every day, and you got to practice and practice and practice. And at first, it's gonna feel like death. You know, it's gonna feel like really frustrating, and it just seems like you do a lot of crap. But you know, don't think of it as your work as being crap. Just think of it as being practice. You know, you'll always improve. You know, give yourself at least a year. Give yourself a solid year, you know, before you get really good at it. You know, it'll probably take you more than a year, but you know, it depends on what other disciplines you may have under your belt, and you know, but give yourself time. It's like it's just one of those things. You just gotta keep. You never stop learning either. It's not like you all of us one day you know everything. You know, when it comes to art, you gotta really practice. I practice every day, and the more you practice, the quicker you become. So if you find you're a little slow at first, you know, don't even worry about that. The speed comes with practice and proficiency and time. So you just gotta put in the time. So I think I'm gonna stop here with this video, and because I've talked on for about an hour, so I'm hoping most of you are still with me, and I apologize for taking so long. But try practicing some of these at home, and I'll make available the images. I'll post them up in the about section of each of these videos, so that you guys can use the reference images if you want. But if you noticed, I really didn't use the planes in this part. Okay, so I really appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you got something out of it. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment in the comment section. And you know, if you found the video, if you found it was interesting and useful, please give it a like. and I will see you in the next video. In the meantime, keep practicing, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. See you in the next video.